Welcome to Mind, America's Lignite Energy Podcast, brought to you by the Lignite Energy Council of North Dakota. Here's your hosts, Kate Muggerud and Geoff Simon.
All right, welcome here to Mind, Lignite Energy in America, and welcome for another episode. I have my co-host and my sidekick, Geoff. How are you, Geoff?
Doing all right, Kate.
Awesome. And today, some of my listeners here will remember last season I had the opportunity to interview Charles Gorecki. He's the CEO of the Energy and Environmental Research Center out of Grand Forks, North Dakota. Charlie really shared with us, that was probably one of my favorite episodes that we did, some of the up and coming technology that the EERC is working on. And today I'm glad to have him back on the show. Charlie, welcome.
Thank you, Kate. Great to be here.
Cool. Season 2, we're doing it a little different. We're doing video. So thanks for being a part of the video podcast. It seems like everything's kind of evolving here in the world that we're living in. So appreciate you being a part of it. How are things in Grand Forks?
Going well. We've had a wonderful summer aside from COVID. It's been great weather, and the kids have been able to play outside quite a bit and ride bike over to the golf course. So it's been all right. Fishing's been good. So
it's kind of given us reminded kind of me of summers growing up where kids aren't necessarily inside, but it's taken us outside to explore kind of what the beautiful state of North Dakota has to offer. So that's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Cool. So we'll dive right in here. Can you talk a little bit about, just for people who might not have heard our podcast last season, the history of the EERC and kind of how that relationship looks like with the Lignite Energy?
Sure. Well, the EERC started actually originally in the 1950s as a part of the U.S. Bureau of Mines, with the focus on low-rank coals, lignite coals, Western coals in general. Became part of the U.S. Department of Energy when it was formed in the 70s, and then it was defederalized under President Ronald Reagan in the 1980s and became part of the University of North Dakota. We're a non-teaching branch of the university focused on solving the challenges that our industry has related to energy and the environment. Our focus and our roots are in lignite. A lot of the work that we did was pioneering with respect to facilities like the Dakota Gasification Company's facility near Beulah, looking at solving those challenges related to SOx, NOx, mercury. EERC was a pioneer in all those technologies. And today we're really working a lot on carbon capture, utilization, and storage as well. In addition, we've got about 220 people. And we've branched out from just focusing on lignite and low-rank coals and how to burn coals and capture emissions to all kinds of other energy and environmental topics.
Awesome. So it's moving and shaking things. That's for sure. So when you think about some of the projects that you mentioned there with the ERC, what are some of the more prominent ones over the past 5 years that you come to mind?
Well, one that I've had the privilege of working on since I started, I began working at the EERC in 2007, and I started working on the Plains CO2 Reduction Partnership Program. That program actually began before I got to the EERC in 2003 with the focus of understanding our CO2 emissions in the region. And the PECOR region includes North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, South Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Missouri, Nebraska, and then up into Canada, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia, and Manitoba as well. Our focus initially was to look at what the point sources of carbon dioxide are, understand them, and then also look at, once we know where those carbon dioxide sources are there places that we can store or utilize that carbon dioxide? And that moved into about 2005 to 9. Once we had understood where they were, we started doing some small-scale pilot injections, and then in 2009 through 19, we actually worked with several commercial operators to look at commercial-scale CO2 injection for enhanced oil recovery and associated storage, which have been very successful. So, I mean, that project was really exciting one to work on.
Charlie, you've had the project I don't know how directly EERC was involved, but the Dakota Gasification Plant has been shipping carbon dioxide up to the Weyburn, Saskatchewan for a while now. I've heard, for enhanced oil recovery, actually, and I've heard some cases those recovery rates are quite remarkable. Like they're getting a lot of the oil out of the ground with CO2, and that really bodes well, I think, for the future of North Dakota's oil patch.
Absolutely. And they have, so enhanced oil recovery with carbon dioxide actually started in the 70s. Weyburn was much later and had a different style of injection and production wells. And you're absolutely right, Geoff. It was kind of like a next generation enhanced oil recovery project in the sense that it had horizontal production wells and I think a mix of vertical and horizontal injection wells. And it's created a much higher recovery rate even than what you got in West Texas. So we've been looking at that quite a bit when we think about capturing carbon dioxide from our coal-fired power plants in North Dakota and the region, and then using it for enhanced oil recovery and things like the Bakken, perhaps. We're trying to crack that nut right now. The Bakken could take millions of tons of carbon dioxide per year for enhanced oil recovery and maybe have some of those similar type recovery rates.
Yeah, that is an element of Project Tundra, am I right? At some point, that potentially could be.
Could be. Right now, Project Tundra, the focus is on dedicated storage right there at the Milton R. Young Power Station near Center. But if the market were amenable to it, they could sell that carbon dioxide for enhanced oil recovery and capture a tax credit at $35 a ton if it's used for enhanced oil recovery, or if they use it in dedicated storage, $50 a ton.
Exciting prospect anyway. Oil prices certainly aren't going to justify it today, but I think we're going to need oil for many decades to come. So
yeah, I think you're right. It's interesting, when Weyburn was started, you bring up an interesting point. When Weyburn was started, oil price was pretty low. It was pre-spike on oil price. So a lot of those deals actually do happen when oil price is low, and then they pay off over the long term.
Mm-hmm. So Charlie, can you tell us a little bit about PECOR? You just mentioned it, but the partners involved and kind of where phases are in that specifically?
Yeah, PECOR is really a partnership. Since the beginning in 2003, it's had over 120 partners, industry, government, research-focused partners, non-government organizations as well. The first phase, as I kind of alluded to, was the characterization phase. That's where we tried to characterize the sources and sinks. The second phase was what we called the validation phase, and that's where we did a number of pilots, a couple of injections one into a lignite coal in North Dakota, as well as a couple of injections into oil fields, and then also a terrestrial storage, which is where you return marginal cropland to native prairies and marshlands. And then we moved into what was called the demonstration phase, looking at, in this case, we worked with Denbury Resources in Montana at the Bell Creek oil field and monitored over 5 million tons of storage and injection for enhanced oil recovery there. We're now in what's referred to as the PECOR Initiative. So it's another project entirely, but building off the success of PECOR. And really the focus here is to identify and break down the roadblocks to wide-scale commercial deployment. So what are the regulatory challenges? What are the policy challenges? I think we have it figured out pretty well from the technical standpoint, but there's things that need to be taken care of from the perspective of, like I said, policy and regulatory, social acceptance, things like that. Bringing down the cost is also important, especially with respect to the capture and infrastructure.
So this is a pretty extensive project, and it's something that's going to be the longevity of it. I mean, we're looking far into the future with it.
Yeah, the PECOR initiative just began this year. It's a 5-year program. The roadmap that the Department of Energy, U.S. Department of Energy has, they're the primary funder of this program. They have the storage technologies and the capture technologies coming together here in between 2020 and 2025, where we need to get this thing into the commercial space. And so that's really a goal of mine personally, and the EERC's is to help develop those technologies to make it safe, effective, and affordable for the people of North Dakota and the region.
So one of the things that I really enjoyed us talking about last season was the CO2 capture and kind of that recovery process. So when we're looking at the ERC with it in the focus on capturing that CO2 from new and existing coal plants, what kind of research are you guys doing right now specifically pertaining to that?
Well, we actually just wrapped up some testing at Milton R. Young's power station. So we have a CO2 capture system. It's a small scale system. Built it at the EERC, but we took it apart and actually brought it out to Milton R. Young's power station and captured a portion of their CO2 stream to see what, if we were to do this on a large scale, what would be any of the unknowns, right? Try to understand how the system would actually behave with the solvents that we were potentially going to use with their actual flue gas at the plant. So that's an example of some of the research that we're doing. That's really on the pre-feed. Minn Kota is now going to embark upon the feed study itself. So getting very close to making that investment decision on building the capture facility. They need to complete the feed study first, of course.
Charlie, one of the things I've heard about, or I guess I know about CO2 capture and sequestration, is that it tends to be very energy intensive and in that respect becomes rather expensive. Are there potential other methods to make this maybe a little bit more affordable? I think a lot of the cost probably is associated with compression if you're going to sequester and push the CO2 underground. But talk a little bit about the cost of the research, I guess.
Of the research, there's a number of different goals the Department of Energy has as far as cost per ton of CO2 capture. And so the capture system itself has a great big upfront capital expenditure, and then it's got an ongoing operating expenditure. The capital cost upfront can be pretty large, on the order of perhaps $1 billion for a coal-fired power plant. And then the ongoing costs really come into play depending upon the capture system, but the regeneration costs. So the use of steam to regenerate your solvents, if you're using a solvent, for example, to capture the carbon dioxide. And then as you alluded to, after you have it captured, then you need to compress it. And that is another big energy cost. So trying to compress 1 million tons or 2, 3, 4 million tons per year requires quite a bit of energy in the space of compression. What we're trying to do is bring that carbon dioxide into a dense phase so that we can more easily inject it into the subsurface or transport it long distances by pipeline. Very similar to the density, not as dense as water, but very similar to that density, so it's more easy to transport.
Yeah, it just seems widespread deployment if you're ever going to achieve that commercially. It's got to make economic sense, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that number, I kind of alluded to it already. The tax credit, the 45Q tax credit for dedicated geologic storage is $50 per ton. So if you have the ability to utilize a tax credit, and you have a tax, so in other words, you have a tax liability, you can offset those taxes with a tax credit, and that $50 a ton is right on the edge of being economically viable for a coal-fired power plant to capture it, compress it, and inject it in an ideal scenario. And we have those ideal scenarios in North Dakota. We have this great juxtaposition between mine mouth coal-fired power plant that overlays thousands of feet of suitable geology in the most stable part of North America, really.
So, apologies there for my dog barking. That's the world we live in here with our Zoom go-to meetings and COVID. But when you mentioned the 45Q tax credit, can you talk to us a little bit about just a quick overview of what that is for listeners that might not be familiar with it?
Yeah, the 45Q tax credit allows for up to $50 a ton for CO2 that's captured and permanently stored in a geologic formation or $35 per ton if it's used and associated with enhanced oil recovery. You can capture that CO2 tax credit for up to 12 years under the current rule. And as I said already, you have to have a tax appetite. So our co-ops, for example, don't. They would need outside investment in the capture facility in order for that tax credit to be captured by someone. And our congressional delegation is actually looking at ways of making that tax credit more usable for our coal-fired power utilities in the state and the region.
Okay, cool. So, I mean, it definitely is something that it does influence some of the ERC's research programs, if I'm understanding it.
Yeah, it's not something that the EERC obviously takes advantage of in any way. Our research is really trying to help industry bring down the cost of capture, maybe help them develop new capture technologies that are more, maybe reduce capital upfront or lower operating expenditure, maybe lower regeneration, or maybe it's just a whole different system design that takes advantage of waste heat at the power facility or something like that. Those are the types of things that the EERC works on to help drive down that cost so that a power producer like Minn Kota can make it work from the perspective of the economic side.
Interesting. Okay, cool. So kind of switching over here. So what do we know specifically about the Geology in Oliver and Mercer counties that make them good places to store that CO2?
Well, we have been doing research in that area for quite some time. As I mentioned, the PECOR partnership program had looked at that area extensively since the beginning in 2003, because in that area, we have 5 coal-fired power plants, or had 5 coal-fired power plants. We've already had one that's been shut down, and there's discussion of another one being shut down. But that area in a 50-mile radius around Washburn has a lot of our point sources. So in order to make things pencil out more easily, we should look close to those sources and see if there's suitable geology. And we did that. There are a couple of legacy wells in that area where we're able to look at the core and the logs from those, where core and logs existed. And we saw from those initial assessments that there did look like there was suitable geology. We've recently worked on a couple of projects that are related to PECOR but different. If you've heard of the carbon safe projects, we actually drilled a couple of wells, one near Golden Valley, very close to Antelope Valley Power Station and Dakota Gas. And we targeted the Broom Creek Formation. And this is someplace between 5,000 and 7,000 feet in depth, depending upon where you're at. And we also drilled another well by Center, North Dakota, right by Milton R. Young's power station. And the goal in both of those cases was to investigate the suitability of the Broom Creek Formation, which we knew was there based on old logs, which we knew from the logs and the core was a sandstone formation overlain by shales, so that you have a suitable place to inject with good injectivity, but a cap that would prevent any fluids from leaving the system and getting out to the environment. And when we drilled those wells and collected the core, that was certainly confirmed. So we saw very good sandstones, very competent seals, combination of shales and salts, which will prevent any fluid from leaving. And since that time, there's also been other wells that have been drilled in the region looking at the Broom Creek, the Indian Car Formation, which is the primary saltwater injection target in western North Dakota. Also in that area not being utilized for saltwater disposal. So it has all the right things. It's got suitable caps. It's got great injectivity with respect to the sandstones. And the other piece about it is there isn't a lot of wells in the area because it's not a hydrocarbon region. You need to go a little further west before you get to the formations that contain hydrocarbons. So currently these sandstones are filled with salt water with no potential use. So injecting and storing carbon dioxide is a great option.
As you mentioned, Charlie, there, that these same formations are used in other parts of the Bakken and western North Dakota for saltwater disposal of produced water from oil wells. what I know about them is there's a massive amount of room down there that this can hold a lot of volume of liquid or, in this case, liquefied CO2, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You mentioned a good point. Currently, Western North Dakota, the Indian Kara Formation is the primary target. There are more than 500 wells, probably more than 1,000 wells at this point that are injecting salt water into the Indian Kara Formation at a volume greater than all of the carbon dioxide emissions from all of the sources in North Dakota. So if we think about it from the perspective of can we do it? Absolutely. We have the space. We're doing the equivalent right now with salt water. We can do that also with carbon dioxide. We're not having any induced seismicity. There are challenges with respect to how close different wells are placed to each other and things like that, but nothing that's insurmountable.
That's really cool. So I know last time we talked, I asked you what the future looks like at EERC, what the next 5 years look like for you specifically. If you had to answer that question again, you know, where are you at? Where are we looking?
Well, it's a great time to work at the EERC. We're working on a whole host of different technologies. The carbon dioxide capture, utilization, and storage is obviously a big one. Some of the other interesting projects that we've been working on are related to what else can you do with Lignite? What else is in Lignite? We have the EERC was recently named the State Energy Research Center in the last legislative session. And this is a project and a designation for the EERC where we can look at the exploratory research to develop the next set of energy technologies for the next decade or generation, really. And one of the interesting projects that we had was trying to take lignite and turning it into, in this case, graphene. Lignite is worth very little, right, in itself. It's very expensive to ship, but graphene is worth an enormous amount of money. So one of our researchers was actually able to take lignite and turn it into graphene dots, which is the precursor to making graphene. So those are the types of technologies. And another one, some of our lignites in North Dakota contain higher amounts of, or the highest recorded amounts of rare earth elements that we've seen in any other coals in the United States. If we're able to take those lignites and extract rare earth elements from them, of course, rare earth elements also are critical in things like cell phones, the U.S. Department of Defense, critical for that, batteries, a whole host of different things, computers. And so our rare earth elements in our lignites are really a high level. So that's another technology that we've been looking at is, okay, so if we can identify those lignites, can we easily take them out of the lignite coal? And at the same time, would we at the end have a higher value fuel in the lignite, plus the benefit of having rare earth elements that were produced in North Dakota as opposed to being sourced from, say, China?
I'd heard that there were actually, well, probably multiple different ways of trying to extract the rare earth minerals, but one of them was, as I understood it, that the minerals actually stay in the ash after the coal is burned. So you could potentially extract these minerals from the fly ash after, it's basically a waste product then.
Sure, that's exactly true. So you can get it beforehand. It's kind of like the gasification, right? So or the post-combustion capture, right? So it's the same type of idea. You can take the rare earth elements out of the ash, or you can try to get them out of the lignite beforehand. And there might be different processes that you need to use to get them out post as opposed to pre-combustion. So we've been looking at both. We've also been partnering with some innovative companies to look at using lignite as building materials. And it's not something that you would imagine using coal to build something like a house out of, but it's got fantastic properties and surprisingly strong, lightweight, and flame resistant when mixed with the proper polymers.
Lignite's pretty amazing stuff. And we're probably getting close to the end here, Kate, but I wanted to ask Charlie, just from a global perspective, future of lignite, we hear all about the war on coal, and there's, people who say that, the demise of coal is inevitable, but you look around the planet and China added something like 12 gigawatts of coal-fired generation in the first 6 months of this year. India and Brazil and other places, Japan, are building coal plants. The one thing I think people need to understand about lignite is it's baseload generation is what we've got these plants here. And just from the larger perspective, I think at some point energy reality kicks in and people have to appreciate the value of coal and its contribution to North Dakota's economy and the U.S. economy in general.
Yeah.
You hit on a great point, Geoff, and you're right. We could shift away from coal into another energy in the United States, but the fact of the matter is the rest of the world is going to utilize the resources they have to make the power that as cheap as they possibly can. And we have an incredible opportunity in the United States to be able to develop the technologies to, for example, capture the carbon dioxide, bring down the cost of it, and then develop a technology so that we could use it for enhanced oil recovery, dedicated storage, producing a power that has very low or no carbon emissions, and then transfer that technology around the world. So regardless of whether or not, again, we use coal, other countries are going to. So it's, I think, incumbent upon us to develop those technologies that can be utilized everywhere else.
One of the things too, we had talked about just kind of how we have our technology and based in what some of the projects that EERC is working on, we really have a national presence of people kind of looking at what we're doing and looking to the technologies that you're developing and working on. Talk a little bit about that. You guys obviously aren't just specifically focused in North Dakota, but really there's a national presence of how this technology can work in different areas.
Yeah, well, you kind of hit on a good point. Of course, we are University of North Dakota, State of North Dakota employees, but we've worked in all 50 states and 52 countries around the world. So even though, North Dakota is our home, we're developing technologies everywhere and really worked on most power plants in the United States, many of the mines throughout the United States, oil and gas fields around the world, and then just developed technologies and applied them all over the place.
Yeah, I just think that's so cool. Just, when we visited last season, how, looking at the presence that you're really having and that's just something to be really proud of. So.
Absolutely.
Cool. Geoff, anything else you want to touch on here?
Just like to see these guys out there on the cutting edge, man. They are really leaders in the country and globally. And right here at University of North Dakota. That's pretty cool.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, Charlie, thanks so much for joining us again. We appreciate it. And it's always so good to talk to you.
Well, thank you, Kate and Geoff. Good talking with you, and we'll see you again soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Mind, America's Lignite Energy Podcast. For more information on lignite energy in North Dakota, visit lignite.com.